Welcome to Queer Pop. I'm Derek Newman still, and this is,
Nathan Caro-Fréchette.
and we're here to talk a little bit over the next little while about elements of queer popular culture. We're going to explore things like erasures of queerness from pop culture, the way that we're described in pop culture, the problematic nature of the depiction of queerness in pop culture, and of course also the way that we're celebrated. Just to start out, I figure maybe we can do some introductions. Nathan, do you want to tell folks a little bit about yourself, both in terms of your identity and how you come to pop culture, the kinds of ways that you participate in it?
So my name is Nathan, and I'm many, many things. I'm a queer trans man. I'm also disabled, and I have mental illness. I'm always looking for representations of my various identities and seeing very, very little of it to go around. In terms of my artistic background, I am a comic book author as well as an author of fiction and nonfiction. I was also an educator for a long time, teaching creative writing, and now I work in a public library. So I have a lot of background in books. I'm also one of the founder of the Ottawa-based Renaissance Press, publishers of diverse Canadian fiction, and yeah, that covers me. I do the comic book, Some Assembly Required, online, and I'm also working currently on a memoir of my transition and my wife's transition.
I think that's it's really important to mention also the way that memoirs work in a lot of queer fiction as well. Um, a lot of us tend to do memoir type work at least at some point in our careers, and I think it's really interesting the way that we articulate that.
Yeah, and to segue into this a little bit before you introduce yourself, I think that we seek out shared experiences so much that
Absolutely.
we end up telling our stories because we end up telling it so often to everybody that we meet. I think that a little part of it is also, at least for me, the desire to do a memoir is a little bit. I get so many questions, and every time that I introduce myself, for registering my children at school to going to the nurse's office to, applying for a job because of the complications of being transgender. I have a lot of explaining to do, and when people find out that I'm transgender and my wife is transgender and we have biological children, everybody gets full of questions, and a lot of the time, some of these are not appropriate questions, and so I get very tired of answering and telling stories. Although I enjoy telling it for most of the time because it's a very happy story. But, a memoir is sort of my way of like, here, you can read about it.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things too, when we hear about coming out stories, especially in popular fiction, they're often portrayed as a singular thing, a one-time thing. But that's not the reality of queer lives. We have to constantly come out every time we meet a new person who all of a sudden asks a question that is based in heteronormativity. Like, they whenever assumptions are made, we then have to go, okay, so here's my background, and then they want to hear the coming out story. So it makes sense. Like we're so often telling our autobiographies anyway,
Yeah.
that it's not too much of a difference for us to write it down or to perform it on stage or in some way to represent our story in a public performance, since our bodies are already made public by that heteronormativity that assumes that we need to constantly explain our presence in the world.
Exactly. Now, what about you?
So it's interesting too. I'm really glad that you mentioned that search to find yourself in literature, because that's something that I think is common between us as well. I grew up in a small town called Fenland Falls. I'm queer as well as disabled. I have multiple different disabilities, including a spinal disability and Also, learning disabilities. I'm dyslexic. I have ADD. I have several memory sorting disabilities, and also psychological disabilities, depression and anxiety. Um, and I think it's really important that we acknowledge that interlinking of our different identities, that we're not just queer folk, but we also occupy different communities, like the disabled community,
Yes.
and also our communities of work. I'm finishing my PhD at Trent University, and I also teach there occasionally. And I think that's part of that identity too. And I think we interlink our identities even when we're wearing the hat of a librarian or an academic or a teacher. We bring some of that queerness and disability into the classroom, and open up new learning opportunities for our students to expand their ideas of what constitutes normalcy.
Exactly. And we're always, talking about our own experiences because when you're talking about identity, all the data is experience.
Yeah,
And that's the only thing you can talk about. And the more you bring to the table, the more diversity people are exposed to, and the less fear there is out there.
absolutely. And at least that's the hope anyway, because I do know in some cases, like for example, I've taught a comic course before, and when I was teaching it, I brought up, of course, I brought in different comic creators with disabilities, different queer comic creators, and try to talk about that length of things, hoping that there would be an opportunity there to educate. But not surprisingly, there's always a small group of bigots, and in this particular classroom, there was a small group of conservative students that took the class particularly because they heard it was a quote unquote feminist comic course, and so they wanted to disrupt it. And that kind of thing does happen. And there's a lack of willingness to learn, to expand one's portfolio or profile in those cases. They just want to hear stories about straight, white, able bodied men, cisgendered men.
Yeah.
Anything else that was like not good enough to be in a comic course.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of such a paradox because all they want to see is themselves, and they
Yeah,
don't understand that we want the same thing.
absolutely. And admittedly, I like seeing people other than myself too. I really like seeing comics that feature people of color, for example, and I present very white. um, but I think it's really important to have that diversity because I know what it's like
Exactly.
to be sort of isolated from literature, especially like the era that both of us grew up in. There wasn't a lot of queer material. There's
Oh no.
significantly more now. Um, but even then, like there's still problematic representations.
Well,
And
actually, in comics, because of the comics code was still very much alive in the 80s when we were young,
yeah,
it, we didn't have any good
no,
representation.
no, absolutely. You would get the occasional. I remember the one comic where North Star from Alpha Flight in Marvel Comics briefly blurted out that he was gay, and then immediately that storyline was just ended. It was just erased and gone. And
Actually, this happened twice. In the 80s, he didn't
yeah,
come out as gay. He came out as maybe having AIDS,
ah,
and it was meant to hint that he was gay. And even so, when you think about it, like the identifier is this terrible disease. This
yeah,
is this is what the hint is.
absolutely. Oh, and even in films and things, when you would see a queer character, they would be depicted as being mentally ill because of being queer. They would be, and not just like having um, a a mental illness, but also violent in terms of their expression of that. They'd be serial killers and murderers. So I kept on seeing queerness in a lot of horror films, but it was never. It's interesting because we often live our lives under threat. We live our lives under threat from of violence, from homophobes, and yet when we see horror fiction, we see ourselves on the screen as the dangerous monster. We don't see ourselves being portrayed as the person experiencing the fear. We're the thing that creates the fear.
Yeah,
I'm glad that at least we're seeing some changeovers in terms of that. And I think a lot of that has to do with the work of activists in our community
definitely.
who are pushing boundaries. So, just in terms of a bit of background, what were some of the first queer representations that you identified with? What were some of the first representations that really mattered to you?
Oh, wow. Some of the first. Probably, and it's going to sound very, very silly, but um, Anne Rice's vampires were my closest approximation of like queer identities. I think I was
Yeah.
maybe 11 when I read, you know, the I think the first two or three books were out at this point. And you know, there were some very queer things happening in these books. They were very, you know, underplayed. But if you were looking for it, it was there. And it was a weird sort of feeling. Like I had this feeling that these people were like me in a way that I could not put my finger on, and this launched a very long and elaborate vampire goth phase. Um,
Yeah. It's really interesting that happens for a lot of us in the queer community. And it's often figures like because for so long the depiction of queerness was always abstracted onto the monster, onto the
yes,
villain. So many of us saw the potential in the monster for something to read ourselves through, and to
exactly.
see, the othered person, the person who's rejected by society.
Yeah,
Uh,
and
and so I know a lot of
actually I went straight from there to Poppy Z. Bright.
yeah,
And who Drawing Blood remains one of my favorite books of all time. I think it's probably one of my top three books. It's one of those books that I just reread once in a while for comfort, which is odd because it is a horror story. But
yeah.
I found myself in this book at the age of maybe 13 or 14, and it was incredible.
And I think often it's interesting the way that we find ourselves in the margins, right? And we often find the potential for our representation in these strange little places where we take comfort that other people are like, this is terrifying. And but often we find, I think, because we're regularly under threat as queer people, we find our comfort at the margins in those little spaces where we can sort of like get away from it all. I'm just checking also. Do I remember correctly that Poppy actually transitioned?
Yes, Poppy actually transitioned.
Billy Martin is his
Yeah,
new
Billy
name, right?
Martin is his new
Yeah.
name.
And yeah, I think Billy did a lot when publishing under the name Poppy to really encourage people um, to reflect on this image of horror and the monstrous from a queer lens, to be able to
Very
see
much so.
ourselves in. I think it's interesting how often we're told by people, like, especially by folks in Hollywood, like, what does representation matter? When we ask those questions about things like, for example, for the longest time, people were asking this question about the various Star Trek series, like,
Yeah.
why isn't there queer representation? Where are we? We have so many other representations. And for goodness sakes, we've got aliens that people identify with, but there's still somehow in this immense galaxy, there's still no queer folk.
Yeah.
Um, and whenever those questions are asked, people always respond with these kind of like offhanded, like, it doesn't really matter. And I mean, so many of us in the queer community, we find our connections through different social media. I remember growing up, especially again because I was in a small town, I thought I was the only queer person. I thought there was something seriously wrong with me.
Yeah.
Um, Up until grade 11, interestingly, like high school, when I encountered, there was a video of someone who was coming out. And I was like, what is this? Oh my God, there's people like me? And so it was really interesting to see people living their lives queer. And it was just in a film. There was that
Yeah.
instant thought to myself, like, oh wow, I can actually be me. And about a week after I saw it, I came out to my mom, and it's sort of like all of a sudden I had an identity, I had a place, and I wonder about how things have changed now with a lot of queer youth because there's a lot more opportunities to connect with people, even folks in small towns. I know this is sounding like overly optimistic, but there are connections through the internet. They can find access to communities. They can Google something. They don't have to go to the library and then find out that there's no books on anything related to sexuality.
Yeah.
And I know this is obviously changing, especially yourself being a librarian.
Yes.
Have have you had the opportunity to direct queer youth or queer folks towards queer lit?
Yes, actually, it happened a couple of times recently within the last year. A couple of non-binary high school students from the high school next door came into the library, and they kind of spotted me and I spotted them. You know how it is. Like the gaydar thing is really sort of like us going like, "Hey, you're like me." Because there's a sense of kinship. And so they came over, and then we had a chat about bathrooms and about books and about many things, and I recommended a few novels, with people who are transgender and non-binary, and it was amazing. And then it happens that the OPL, the organization that I work for, actively produces lists of books dedicated to LGBT youth. So
Mhm.
we actually have like handouts. They can go like, look at these books.
I think it's really interesting too the way that we folks who occupy public spaces can either be gatekeepers preventing access to books and resources on queerness, or can be sort of leaders to be able
Yeah.
to actually help people through that maze of of different information to find the things that they need, to find the things that speak to them in a really strong way. I know when I was in university when I was younger, um, I had worked at a bookstore and actually saw one of my colleagues take a book out of a young person's hands and tell them that they didn't want to read the book because it had queer characters. And and I think about that kind of editing that happens, right? And this stuff still happens. People regularly will be like, will tell, especially young people, that various books aren't appropriate for them because they feature queer identities, and assume that somehow that's a contamination, like somehow queerness is a contagious thing that it leaks right off the pages and infects you.
And the thing is, there is a part of truth to that. Because when you see yourself at last somewhere, there is that feeling of, oh my God, I am not broken.
Yeah,
There are people like me. It's a thing. It has a name, and it's normal. And people are starting to realize that younger because we give them the space to do so.
yeah,
And we give
absolutely.
them people to look up to who are like them. And so they can not only see themselves and realize something about themselves without having to go through 30 years of pain and suicidal thoughts, but
Yeah.
they can also see that, you know what, there are people like me and they turn out okay. They have lives and families and careers and people who love them.
It's one of the reasons why I have conflicted feelings about it, but parts of me really like the "It Gets Better" campaigns, letting kids know that there is at least a possibility. I think it's also problematic because it's a campaign that suggests things like that things are only that they're only going to have to struggle with society for a short period of time, and then that there's a
It
magical
creates false
happily ever after.
expectations.
When in reality, there is always a struggle, but it's about finding your family, finding especially you and I have talked a bit before, Nathan, about the idea of family of choice,
Yes.
and I think that's something really important for the queer community, because most of us, at least, are produced by straight parents, um, and often cisgender straight parents, and so it's sort of we often have to find mentors in our own community. We have to find folks to talk about. Can you talk a little bit about that process for you of finding a like a family by choice of choice.
Definitely. So I'm very lucky in my background. My both my parents were very loving, supporting people who only wanted the
Yeah,
best for me. Obviously, they were also, you know, cisgender and heterosexual, and didn't really have any experience dealing with anybody who was transgender
yeah,
not cisgender, straight, heterosexual, like everything. So, you know, they tried their best and they did a fantastic job. Of course, there's a couple of frictions of like, uncomfortableness and
yeah.
everything, but um, even if you have the most loving parents in the world, when they can't relate to your experience and they they can't understand, you know,
No,
it's like if you're a parent, you can't understand what it's like if you're not a parent. So
yep,
it's a sort of experience that's so hugely important to the person that you are that it's you can't explain it. You can't, even
yeah,
if you're the most empathetic person in the world, you simply cannot grasp what it's like. And so there is that sort of disconnect with you and your family of birth, where you don't have those shared experiences. And you don't have, someone who's been there who can tell you it does get better. Not
absolutely.
because the obstacles are removed, but because you become more resilient and you find the people that you love and you know yourself better. But there
Yeah,
is that fear and that loneliness of not having someone to talk to. And so
absolutely.
for me, finding my family of choice has always been other queer people. There's that
Yeah,
sort of. I saw a meme on Facebook the other day, and it was, like other dogs are like, other dog, other dog, other dog. Well, I'm like
yeah,
that with queer people going, other queer, and it's so gratifying to like find someone and have a conversation and they get it. They get it because
absolutely.
they've been there. And the
There's
commiseration is incredible. And this is why I think for queer people, the concept of family is so important because when you're a minority, you need to have that commiseration with someone because life is hard.
yeah,
Every day you're faced with more obstacles just because of who you are, and you need to be able to talk about this with people who will go, yeah, yeah, I know, and mean it, you know, and other communities who are marginalized, based on their skin color, on their religion, on their culture, it's something that all of their family has in common.
or at
When
least in cases of people who are in like families that have parents of different backgrounds, but
yeah,
there's at least a family member or a
exactly,
number of members who get it.
exactly,
And it's sort of different for us queer folk. We rarely have another queer person in the family, or at least especially another out queer person in our family that we can talk to about the experience because we kind of create our own culture, and it's often from like you were saying, that shared narrative that we have with other queer folk, being able to actually do that, like identifying people and being like, oh, good, we have something in common. We have a shared story to tell, even if it's a different aspect of that story, because all of our stories are different depending on where we come from, how we got there. But
exactly.
there's at least something around like, so coming out tough, right?
And like I said, I was extremely lucky in my background, and this particular part of my upbringing. But
Yeah,
uh, most of us are not.
no,
We
exactly.
are disproportionately at risk for violence from family members, for rejection,
Yeah,
for being cast out on the streets. So many of my friends were, and my parents actually had to house a few of them for a while, and I was very lucky to be able to offer this to my friends, but you know often we have very strained relationships with our families.
Yeah,
So this concept of being able to rely on each other is so important that, you're another queer person, you get it. You don't you don't cast another queer person out on the street. You help them. You're there for
absolutely.
them because we only have each other.
I was thinking about this in terms of. I'm glad that you brought up the topic of violence because I think that's something, especially family violence, that affects a lot of us in the queer community. Um, and I think a lot of it is about policing our bodies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an aspect of myself that I rarely talk about, which is I actually, my spinal disability is because of family violence from my biological father, who um, had issues with my general effeminacy and aspects that about my personality that seemed very queer to him, um, and uh, and he ended up beating me until and regularly beat me, but um, at one point actually permanently damaged my spine because of that. So there are linked narratives there around, for me at least, between ideas of violence and coping with queer identities in the way that we're often exiled. And for me, my disabled identity is very strongly linked to my queer identity because of that homophobic violence, because of that gendered violence that happened in the home. And again, a lot of these issues come from attempts to police who we are and who we can be. And in terms of a lot of family environments, um, there is a lot of strain, like a lot of strain around these notions of how to fit in, how to be part of your family, what kinds of things you bring to your family. Story is not an isolated one. I know a lot of people in the queer community who experienced abuse at young ages
So do I.
um, and often became homeless because of it, experienced rejection and other forms of violence as well, not just physical violence, but um, neglect and verbal violence as well. So I think it's really interesting to think about the ways that we have to speak back to that violence that we um, that as a community we often come together in a very healing way, and I think that's one of the reasons why family by choice is so important. I know it's something that comes up in your books as well, that you talk a lot about that idea of family by choice um, and chosen family and being able to find a community.
Definitely. I mean, my first published series was literally called Family by Choice.
Yeah, and I think this is such an important narrative, right? It's a narrative about finding ourselves and finding the supports around us.
Definitely. And of being able to rely on other people like you.
We rarely get this image in our popular culture. It's often the portrayal of the one queer person amongst all the straights who ends up just being there for relationship advice for straight folks
I'm sorry, relationship and fashion advice.
and
Because
fashion
everybody knows
advice.
that all queer men are experts in fashion.
Absolutely. I know it counts for me. I mean, the number of times that people take me bra shopping and I give expert advice and I'm not so into the boobs. But I can tell you all about. I have my own names for things like the padding stuff I refer to as airbags. I will say I'm probably one of the worst in terms of my own fashion. I wear superhero t-shirts and okay, public admission, I wear Crocs and with socks. Just putting that out there, just so everyone knows. And now we get the boo hiss.
Wait, I'm sorry. Is there something wrong with Crocs and socks?
See?
Okay, so I guess these two queer men are not fashion divas.
No. I mean, I wear pretty darn cool superhero shirts, and I know you do too. So
Oh, yeah,
when it comes to geek chic, it's us.
definitely. And I
But
mean,
admittedly,
admittedly, it is a stereotype.
yeah, exactly.
And
I
yeah, it's almost like as if every representation of queer people was written by someone who knew nothing about them.
Absolutely. I find it really interesting how often you get the image of gay best friend
Yes.
who just yeah, gives fashion advice, gives relationship advice, and is often depicted as being bitchy and queenie. Um, which, admittedly, I take a lot of pleasure in personally being bitchy and queenie, but not all of us do.
Well, it does, beat the tragic coming out or the lesbian death trope.
Can we talk a little bit about some of those tropes, especially things like, um, the vast amount of the portrayal of us as always coming out, and then our stories being complete.
Definitely. That's one of the things that annoys me the most. Coming out is not the end of a story. Coming out is at best the beginning of a story.
Yeah.
And one that if coming out is your story, you will be doing possibly weekly for the rest of your entire life.
Yep.
You know, oh, are you married? Do you have children? Yes, I am married. Oh, so what's the name of your husband? Well, actually,
Yep.
oh, are are you do you live alone? Are you bringing your spouse to the brunch?
Yep. And it's always the spouse is always assumed to be, of the quote unquote opposite gender.
Yeah,
Even though binaries are a big problem for me, but um, it,
definitely. And one of the things that I also assume, especially coming to the do you have children thing, is every time I tell them, especially when I'm passing as male and being read as male, whenever I tell them about my kids and my wife, and if they discuss her pregnancies, well, then I have to
yeah,
go, well, actually, they're mine.
I was I was the pregnant one.
Yep. Oh, yeah, my kids call me mom. That confuses people.
But I think that's part of like a lot of our relationships as queer folk. They're very fluid, they're changeable, and they don't match easy sort of quote unquote traditions, right? Like we don't fit into them. So these narratives never work. They end up reducing us to something that we can't be because it's too simplistic.
Exactly.
I do want to talk about also the extremely problematic lesbian death trope and bring out your gays tropes, as well as what I've been referring to as the tragically trans trope.
Oh, yes.
Uh, the writers who don't know what to do with us and can't imagine the possibility of us having a happily ever after. So they decide to kill us off, to write us into a murder scene or more often than not, a suicide scene. Um, and and this does a lot for us. Like I know for myself, this is going to sound sad, but whenever I decide I'm going to watch queer movies, I also bring along like Kleenex because I'm like I'm going to cry through the entire thing because it will be sad.
Yep.
Um, because inevitably they'll kill off one of us.
Yeah.
Um,
Or we can hope that we'll survive to end up sad and alone because we're queer.
yes, exactly. Once we discover that all of our friends have been slaughtered by someone or whatever. I remember watching Tangerine and at the end being really, really confused because I was like, but none of us died. Like all of the queer folk are still alive. And then just sitting there staring, being like, okay, are they going to do some horrible thing after the credits? And being like, wow, we all lived through this. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of frightening that that's the image of us is always caged in tragedy.
Definitely. And this is one of the topics we'll definitely discuss at length in a future episode. We're,
Yeah.
we're just about running out of time for this one. And I want to talk about a few things that we'll be talking about over the next episode. So, definitely, our next episode is going to be all about monsters,
Woo!
specifically Frankenstein's monster, because Derek and I both have a lot of affection for it.
Yes.
And we're also, we're going to be talking about tropes. We're going to be talking about comic books, movies, everything. And if you have specific requests for subjects, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or to email us using the form on the website.
And do make sure, if you're a Facebook user, check out our Facebook site, which is under the name Queer Pop, and that way you can interact with various of the things that we post, because we do post things that we think might be of interest to you as well, and definitely things that are of interest to us.
Thank you so much for watching.
And we will talk to you again next time.